6 months had passed since Ara's divorce from Damien Blackwood, and in those months, her life had been a quiet, precarious balancing act between survival and secrecy. Ara, a woman whose heart had once been completely shattered by the man she had loved, had devoted herself entirely to creating a world where her son Leo could thrive, untouched by the cold shadows of wealth and power. The very thought of Damien's world, the endless glass towers, the commanding boardrooms, the ruthless deals, was something she wanted to shield Leo from. She'd built a cocoon of simplicity, of scraped knees, bedtime stories, the smell of toast in a cramped apartment that she now called home. Ara's mornings began before sunrise, moving through a schedule that left her no room for distraction. A single mother, an administrator at a small daycare, a careful planner of meals, nap times, and the whims of a 4-year-old with a heart as big as the city skyline itself. She loved Leo fiercely, and she had learned to bury the lingering pain of her broken marriage deep beneath the layers of her quiet life. For 5 long years, she had guarded her secret.
Her own child, a child of a man who had once been everything to her and yet had left her,
leaving only shards of what could have been. But secrets have a way of surviving quietly until the world finds them. The notice arrived like a thief in the night, tucked beneath the door of her modest apartment on a Tuesday morning. The building had been sold. 60 days to leave. Ara's stomach lurched. Her savings, carefully counted and painstakingly hoarded, were laughable compared to the spiraling rent demands of the city. The daycare's funding was being cut. Without it, she would have no income and no support for Leo during the day. Panic, sharp and immediate, sliced through the fragile sense of safety she had constructed. She had no choice. No choice but to step back into a world she had sworn she would never enter again. She needed help, and the only path that might even come close to offering it was the annual philanthropic gala hosted by one of the city's wealthiest families, offering grants for those in financial need. Ara stared at her reflection in the tiny bathroom mirror, smoothing her one good dress over her trembling body, a delicate, sequined gown, simple yet elegant, a mask of hope she hoped would shield her from scrutiny. Leo's laughter echoed in her mind, a bright light in the darkness she had been navigating alone. She kissed his small forehead that morning and left him with a trusted neighbor, a woman whose presence had become a lifeline over the years. Ara walked to the gala, each step heavy with a mixture of fear and determination. The ballroom was a glittering sea of wealth and sophistication, crystal chandeliers refracting the light into 1,000 points of brilliance. The elite moved through the space with practiced ease, glasses of champagne balanced in perfectly manicured hands, smiles tight and polite. Ara felt exposed, a small ordinary woman in a room where money whispered and ambition shouted. And then across the room she saw him, Damien Blackwood. 5 years older, 5 years more commanding, and yet the sight of him tore at the edges of her carefully maintained composure. He stood at the center of a circle of admirers, a man who could bend boardrooms and markets to his will without a second thought. And yet, in the midst of all that power, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes when they locked with hers, a momentary crack in the armor that had kept her awake at night. The world seemed to tilt as the moment stretched. For a heartbeat, 5 years dissolved. But before Damien could cross the room, a small figure darted from behind the curtain. Ara froze, and then she saw him, Leo. Her heart nearly stopped as she watched her son toddle forward, drawn by instinct, toward the man whose DNA he bore. Damien's eyes widened, and the room fell away, leaving only the 3 of them in an invisible spotlight. The boy's small frame, his dark hair, his startling blue eyes, unmistakably his father's. It was in that moment that Ara realized there could be no more lies, no more hiding. Damien's gaze locked onto the child, and for the first time in 5 years, Ara felt the weight of inevitability. There would be confrontation. There would be questions she had long avoided. There would be no turning back, is he mine? Damien's voice was low, controlled, yet it trembled with a mix of fury, disbelief, and something raw, unprocessed, a hint of guilt buried under the surface. Ara met his gaze, her own pale but resolute, the secret of half a decade spilling into the open. She simply nodded, the word hung heavy between them, suffocating in its finality. The billionaire who had controlled empires and markets was suddenly helpless, stripped of all authority in the face of a 4-year-old boy who represented everything Damien had missed and everything Ara had protected. Damien's shock quickly calcified into suspicion. He didn't see a child. He didn't see a family. He saw a liability, a potential threat to the carefully constructed life he had maintained in her absence. He demanded a DNA test, cold and precise, the mechanized solution to a deeply human revelation. Ara complied, her heart heavy at how transactional it had become. There was no celebration, no joy. There was only the quiet terror of knowing that their lives were about to change forever. The waiting was agony. Every moment stretched endlessly. Ara watched Damien's world, the luxury, the precision, the empire, loomed behind him like a wall she had once touched and fled. And when the results finally came, confirming what she had known all along, Damien didn't smile. He didn't feel relief. He felt the raw, untamed edge of responsibility, guilt, and a new, unfamiliar vulnerability. He had a son he had never known, a son whose life he had never touched. And in that realization, every dollar, every deal, every empire he had built became insignificant. Ara returned home that night, her son asleep, the weight of impending change pressing down on her chest. She knew Damien would act. She knew he would use his wealth to insert himself into their lives, to attempt control, to try and shape the narrative he had never been part of. And she steeled herself, knowing that for Leo, she would endure whatever storm came next. The following days were a blur of tension, uncertainty, and barely contained emotions. Ara moved through her routine with the careful precision of someone carrying not just a child, but the weight of a secret now fully exposed. Leo, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents surrounding him, continued to run, laugh, and build towers of blocks in their cramped apartment. But for Ara, every sound, every squeal of delight or giggle was a reminder of what was at stake. Damien Blackwood now knew the truth. He had the DNA confirmation, and with that knowledge came his inexorable presence. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Ara answered it with a polite, professional tone, concealing the whirlwind of emotions beneath layers of careful neutrality. Damien's voice was low, deliberate, sharp, a symphony of power and authority that had once made her knees weak. "It's confirmed," he said. The words were clinical, stripped of warmth. "Leo is mine." Ara swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the phone. "I see," she replied, keeping her voice steady. Her mind raced. She had anticipated this moment, yes, but anticipation was never enough for the weight of reality. Damien's next words carried the unmistakable echo of his corporate mind at work. "We need to discuss arrangements, immediately. I'll be providing housing, education, everything your current situation lacks." "You will comply," Ara's stomach twisted. She had known he would move fast, that he would assert control in the only way he knew how, through power, wealth, and authority. But hearing it spoken aloud, as though Leo were a line item in a ledger, hit harder than she expected. "I appreciate the concern." "Damien," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor underneath. "But Leo is not a transaction." "He is my son, my life." "My decisions matter." There was a pause on the other end, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in Damien's tone. The man who could dictate markets, control empires, and bend CEOs to his will was now navigating uncharted territory. A human being, stripped of all hierarchy, all titles, confronted with the unfiltered truth of his own son. "I understand that," Damien admitted after a moment, his voice unusually soft. "But I will not allow him to grow up without resources, without guidance or—" He paused, his words catching slightly, betraying the faintest hint of vulnerability. "Without knowing his father." Ara felt a chill. He wanted to insert himself into their lives, and she could see the storm on the horizon. The luxurious penthouse, the sprawling apartments, the toys and gadgets he would throw at the situation. They could never replace warmth, love, and the tender consistency that she provided Leo every day. Yet she knew that she could not avoid him forever. The very next evening, a sleek black car pulled up in front of their modest apartment. Damien stepped out, impeccably dressed despite the late hour, his presence commanding as ever. Ara met him at the door, the weight of years past and the months of solitude and protection clashing in her chest. Leo peeked around her legs, wide-eyed, sensing the tension before understanding its full meaning. "This isn't a negotiation," Damien began, his gaze fixed on her. "It's a responsibility. I am his father, and I intend to act as such," Ara straightened, meeting his eyes. "Responsibility isn't measured in money or gifts, Damien. It's measured in presence, care, and love, something you've been absent from for far too long." The tension was palpable. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words and shared history. Damien's corporate mind struggled to adapt to emotional reality, to recognize that control alone could not repair the chasm between them. And yet, he was determined, as he had always been, to assert himself in the only way he knew, through action, through results. The first week under Damien's influence was a collision of worlds. Ara's small routines were disrupted by a relentless influx of resources, a sprawling penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows, toys arriving in trucks, and schedules drafted as if Leo were a junior executive being groomed for the family empire. Damien insisted on father-son bonding sessions between meetings, showing up in a suit and expecting awe. Ara's frustration grew daily. The small, intimate moments she had cultivated for Leo, story time, bedtime kisses, scraped knee bandages, were now overshadowed by the sterile, meticulously designed interventions of a man who had never learned to speak the language of a child. "You can't just buy his love," Ara snapped one evening, as Damien attempted to replace Leo's worn, tattered teddy bear with a gold-plated gadget. Her voice trembled, equal parts anger and despair. "I am providing for him," Damien shot back, his tone sharp, a reflection of the lifelong habits of a man who saw power as solution. "And for you, Ara, something you clearly struggled to manage." The words were a low blow. The argument spiraled, dragging their unhealed wounds into the open. Leo, too young to understand the subtleties of adult conflict, sat on the floor clutching his teddy, wide-eyed and frightened. It wasn't until a sudden crisis, a late-night fever, brought the true stakes into sharp relief that the tension shifted. Ara rushed him to the emergency room, panic rising as his small body burned with heat. For the first time, Damien followed not as a billionaire asserting control, but as a father stripped of his armor. Hair disheveled, shirt wrinkled, eyes wide with unfiltered fear, he stood beside Ara, hands hovering protectively over Leo's tiny frame. For hours they watched their child, their conflict paused by raw human concern. There were no schedules, no charts, no financial calculations. Just fear, love, and the fragile tether connecting three lives forever changed. When the fever finally broke, the weight of unspoken emotions hung between them. Damien knelt beside Leo, holding him close, his face damp with tears he had never allowed himself to shed publicly. Ara, exhausted but relieved, finally allowed herself a glimpse of hope. In that dim light, the fortress of anger and control began to crack. The night ended, not with grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but with quiet understanding. Damien began to learn that presence, empathy, and patience were as important as wealth, power, and influence. And Ara realized that while the past had shaped their pain, it no longer had to dictate their future. The first weeks of Damien's enforced presence in Ara and Leo's life were a fragile truce, hanging by the thinnest thread. The fever had passed, but the undercurrent of tension remained, pulling at them with quiet insistence. Ara tried to navigate Damien's world, but it was a universe away from the rhythm she had built with Leo. Every moment, from mealtimes to bedtime, was now under scrutiny. His meticulous, corporate-designed improvements, leaving her feeling increasingly powerless. It was during one of these days that the next storm hit, unexpected, uninvited, and devastating. Damien's mother, Celeste Blackwood, arrived at the penthouse without warning. Known for her razor-sharp mind and merciless social commentary, she had always seen Ara as a temporary distraction, a threat to the Blackwood legacy, a woman whose ambitions were shallow compared to the empire she had raised her son to command. Celeste's entrance was like a knife through silk. She moved through the opulent space, appraising the penthouse, the toys, the child, and finally Ara herself with a piercing gaze that left Ara feeling exposed and small. "Ah," Celeste said, her voice sweet yet venomous. "I see you've arranged quite the playground for my grandson. How quaint." Ara's jaw tightened. She had anticipated Damien's scrutiny, his control, even his occasional impatience. But never this. Celeste's presence was another layer of judgment, another reminder of the pressures and expectations from a world Ara had deliberately avoided. Leo clutched his worn teddy bear, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it, his small frame dwarfed by the Blackwood matriarch's commanding presence. The evening dinner, meant to be a quiet family moment, transformed into a battleground. Celeste's words, dripping with condescension, aimed to wound, to destabilize Ara's authority as Leo's mother and protector. "It's fortunate, isn't it, Damien," she said with a sly smile, "that your son has someone to secure the Blackwood lineage while also keeping your responsibilities in check. How did you plan this, Ara? Carefully timed, I presume." The accusation hit Ara like a physical blow. Every insecurity she had fought to bury, her fear of judgment, of inadequacy, of never being enough, was now exposed. Damien, caught between his mother's cutting insinuations and Ara's quiet defiance, stiffened. He wanted to defend Ara, to assert the truth, yet the old habits of suspicion and control tugged at him. His corporate instinct recoiled at the thought of being manipulated, of his life being dissected like a spreadsheet. "Was this your plan all along?" Damien finally demanded, his voice low but tense. The same controlled edge he had always wielded in boardrooms now applied to the sacred territory of their child. "To show up with Leo just when you needed support? To leverage him for assistance?" Ara's face went pale, but her resolve hardened. "You think so little of me!" she cried, her voice breaking under the weight of years of unspoken pain. "I left to protect him. From you, from people like you, from the empire that could never see him as a child. I left to give him a life where he could be loved and safe, not a bargaining chip in someone else's legacy." The words landed with heavy impact. Celeste's expression faltered for the first time, her satisfaction giving way to quiet shock. Damien's fists clenched on the table, knuckles whitening, as he fought against the tidal wave of guilt, anger, and shame rising within him. The years of pride, the ruthless control, the empire building, they were all meaningless in this moment of pure human vulnerability. From the hallway, Leo, drawn by the rising voices, stepped cautiously into the room. His small body trembled, lower lip quivering as he clutched his teddy bear tighter. "Are you leaving again, Daddy?" he whispered, his words slicing through the tension like a scalpel, exposing the fragility of every argument, every resentment. In that instant, everything shifted. Damien's posture softened, the rigid, commanding CEO dissolving into the father he had never allowed himself to be. He knelt beside Leo, pulling him close, murmuring reassurances through a tangle of tears and frustration. "No, buddy, I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice stripped of pride, of anger, of corporate superiority. Ara watched, exhausted, as Damien held Leo, seeing for the first time a vulnerability that humanized him in ways words could not. She understood then that their conflict, every spat over toys, schedules, and control, was meaningless compared to the love they both held for this small, precious boy. The fight didn't magically resolve the past. Scars remained, old wounds throbbed, and the path forward was uncertain. But the breaking point, the moment of raw fear and shared responsibility, had created a bridge between them. Damien began to understand that fatherhood demanded humility, presence, and empathy, qualities that could not be purchased or commanded. And Ara recognized that while his wealth and influence could never replace what she had given Leo, his involvement could be a partner in raising a child who deserved both worlds, love and security. In the days that followed, tentative cooperation emerged. Damien began showing up not as a CEO, but as a father, removing the suits, leaving schedules behind, sitting on the floor with wooden blocks, listening to stories, answering questions, and slowly learning Leo's language. Ara, in turn, allowed him small spaces in Leo's life, cautious but hopeful, yet the tension simmered beneath the surface. Celeste's presence loomed like a shadow, a reminder of expectations, legacy, and judgment that could unravel the fragile piece they were building. The audience, meanwhile, is left with the ultimate hook. Will Ara and Damien withstand the relentless pressure of family, wealth, and past betrayals? Or will the old wounds rip open again, leaving Leo caught in the crossfire of power and pride? The first few weeks after the hospital incident had left Damien shaken in ways no boardroom confrontation ever could. He had seen fear on Leo's small face, a fear that reflected all the times he had been absent, all the moments Ara had shielded the child from his corporate world. That night, as he lay awake in the unfamiliar apartment that Ara now allowed him into, he realized that wealth, status, and power were meaningless compared to the responsibility he carried as a father. It was a cold, quiet morning when the breakthrough began. Ara had prepared breakfast for Leo, simple scrambled eggs and toast, while Damien hovered awkwardly near the counter, unsure how to engage. Leo, now fully recovered, chattered happily about his dinosaur toys, oblivious to the tension still lingering in the air. "You see, Leo," Ara said gently, "this is our morning routine. Breakfast, then we get ready for school. It's simple, but it works." Damien watched quietly, hands stuffed into his suit pockets, eyes darting between mother and son. He wanted to intervene, to make a suggestion, to improve things with some corporate efficiency, but he stopped. For the first time, he allowed himself to observe without judgment, to follow rather than lead. Leo, noticing his father's hesitance, smiled and ran toward him with arms wide. Damien bent down, unpracticed but determined, and scooped him into a hug. The child giggled, pressing his face against Damien's chest. And for the first time, the billionaire felt a connection that had nothing to do with wealth, authority, or pride. Ara watched quietly from the kitchen counter, noting the small but significant gesture. It was tentative, imperfect, and completely human. A spark of hope ignited within her, a hope that perhaps Damien could learn to meet Leo on his level, to become a father who was more than an occasional visitor armed with money and influence. The days that followed were a series of small victories. Damien attended preschool drop-offs, read bedtime stories, and even learned to tie Leo's shoelaces, awkwardly, but with sincerity. Ara began to notice subtle changes in her own heart as well. He wasn't perfect, and he still made mistakes, but he was present. He was trying, and more importantly, he was listening. One afternoon, as Leo built an elaborate block tower on the living room floor, Damien knelt beside him, mimicking his small hands as they carefully balanced each block. "See, buddy," he said, "sometimes you have to go slow, adjust, and try again. Life's a bit like building these towers, isn't it?" Leo looked up at him with bright, trusting eyes. "Yeah, Daddy. And you have to be careful or it falls." Damien chuckled, a rare, unguarded sound. "Exactly." Ara, standing in the doorway, allowed herself a small smile. She had been so afraid to let him back in, worried that he would overstep, dominate, or fail. But watching father and son work together, she realized that trust could be rebuilt, slowly and carefully, through shared experiences and consistent effort. Evenings became a time for co-parenting experimentation. Ara and Damien navigated meal prep, bath time, and bedtime routines together, negotiating responsibilities in ways that neither of them had expected. Arguments still arose, usually over small matters. The temperature of the bath, the color of Leo's pajamas, whether the bedtime story should be read aloud or silently. But these conflicts, once terrifying in their intensity, now became opportunities for compromise, for growth, for understanding. One particularly challenging evening, Leo insisted on wearing his dinosaur pajamas under his new superhero robe, a combination Damien found ridiculous. Ara intervened gently, guiding him with calm authority. Damien, instead of asserting control, took a deep breath and joined in, saying, "You know what, buddy? Dinosaurs and superheroes can be best friends tonight." Leo laughed, delighted by the compromise. Ara felt her heart swell with relief. This was the teamwork she had dreamed of. Meanwhile, Damien began to see the depth of Ara's dedication. She had created a world for Leo that was rich in love, safety, and imagination, a world money could never buy. He witnessed her creativity, patience, and courage, and slowly, his rigid worldview began to bend. The walls he had built around himself, around his heart, began to crack. One evening, after Leo had fallen asleep, they sat together on the couch, a rare, quiet moment. Damien reached out, hesitating slightly. "Ara," he said softly, "I know I've made mistakes. I've been absent, distant, and sometimes selfish, but I want to be better. For him and for us, if you'll let me." Ara studied him carefully, seeing sincerity in his eyes, vulnerability in his posture, and something she hadn't seen in years, a willingness to change. She nodded slowly. "We'll take it one day at a time. That's all I can promise. But I see your effort, and that matters." The next weeks were a delicate dance of rebuilding trust. Damien learned to respect boundaries. Ara allowed small freedoms, and Leo thrived in the middle of it all. The boys' laughter filled the apartment, replacing the tension that had once dominated every corner. But life, as always, was ready to test them. Damien's business demands intensified, pulling him into long meetings and late-night flights. Ara's patience was tested as the pressure of their worlds collided. Yet, the foundation laid during these weeks, the shared fear, the mutual vulnerability, the moments of genuine connection, provided a safety net. No matter the challenge, they had learned they could rely on each other, even if imperfectly. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, the once insurmountable divide between Damien and Ara began to close. The sterile penthouse that had initially felt like a gilded prison for Ara and Leo was transforming. It wasn't just the expensive furnishings or the panoramic city views. It was the laughter echoing through the rooms, the quiet routines, the little gestures of love and attention that stitched their lives together. Damien had learned to see beyond balance sheets and boardrooms. Ara had begun to allow him into the inner sanctum of her heart. Leo was thriving in the newfound stability. His giggles became the soundtrack of the apartment, his tiny hands guiding Damien to understand the small joys of childhood. Building towers, coloring books, bedtime stories, even messy pancake mornings, they became rituals of connection. Each moment reminded Damien that real wealth was measured not in profits, stock prices or property, but in the happiness of the small, precious life he had almost missed. It was during one particularly quiet evening, as the golden city light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, that the final confrontation with the past arrived. Celeste Blackwood returned, this time not as an antagonist, but as a catalyst for closure. She observed the scene before her. Damien kneeling on the floor helping Leo with his puzzle, Ara sitting nearby offering gentle guidance, and the boy beaming at both of them. Celeste's eyes, once cold and judgmental, softened. She realized that the love and dedication she had underestimated in Ara had created something irreplaceable, a family unit that no amount of wealth could replicate or control. She offered no words of reprimand. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging that her son had finally found his place not just as a billionaire, but as a father and partner in co-parenting. The next day, Ara and Damien had a private conversation, one that would finally close the chapter of resentment and fear. "I know we've both made mistakes," Damien began, his voice low, filled with sincerity. "But I want to do better. Not for appearances, not for the world, but for us, for Leo, for this family we've been building." Ara studied him, feeling the weight of years of hurt, but also seeing the effort, the patience, and the genuine care. She nodded slowly, allowing herself to release some of the tension she had carried for so long. "I believe you, Damien, and I want us to be a family, not a team divided by fear and pride. We can't erase the past, but we can create something new." From that moment forward, their lives shifted. Damien started prioritizing presence over perfection, choosing moments of connection over grand gestures of wealth. Ara allowed him into routines and decisions, trusting him to honor the small, sacred aspects of their life. Leo flourished, no longer caught between two worlds, but surrounded by the love of parents who were learning, together, how to navigate the complexities of adult mistakes, childhood wonder, and second chances. The story reaches its emotional climax during Leo's 5th birthday. The apartment was filled with balloons, laughter, and the smells of homemade cake, a far cry from the sterile penthouse of weeks past. Damien and Ara worked side by side, decorating, arranging gifts, and listening to Leo's delighted squeals. In that moment, the city skyline outside seemed to fade, leaving only the warmth and light of a family finally coming together. Damien held Leo close, whispering, "You are my everything, buddy." "Never forget that." Ara watched, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, realizing that the journey of fear, mistrust, and distance had led them here, to a family that had been forged in courage, patience, and unconditional love. And then came the ultimate test, a surprise visit from Damien's business associates, expecting the usual cold, controlled executive. Instead, they found a father kneeling on the floor, a mother laughing at his attempts to tie shoelaces, and a child beaming with joy. Damien's world and Ara's world had collided not in conflict, but in harmony. The lesson was undeniable. True influence and power were meaningless without love, and true wealth was measured not by assets, but by the bonds that could not be bought. The story closes with a final, heart-stirring scene. Damien, Ara, and Leo sitting together by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled over the skyline, mirroring the opening of their story, but transformed. The once lonely billionaire had found joy not in conquest, but in connection. The mother had discovered that trust and courage could rebuild what fear had broken. And Leo, the boy whose existence had been kept secret to protect him, now thrived in a family strengthened by challenges, love, and the choice to forgive. In these quiet, profound moments, the narrative delivers its ultimate viral hook. The richest, most powerful man in the city realized that the smallest life, his son, was the greatest gift he could ever receive. The woman he had once underestimated became the architect of their happiness. And the child, innocent yet wise beyond his years, had taught them all the most valuable lesson of all, that love, courage, and trust are the ultimate forms of wealth.